Hey guys, tonight we're crawling back through the stone-floored corridors of medieval Europe. You're wearing scratchy wool, your breath is visible indoors, and everything smells vaguely like boiled cabbage and wet dog. But no worries, we're not here for the food. We're here to uncover what sex was really like in the Middle Ages. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. We're stepping into a time when pleasure was suspicious, privacy was nearly non-existent, and even in your own bed, someone else might have a say in what you were, or weren't, doing. The church looms like an overprotective chaperone, whispering, "No," every time you even think about getting cozy. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through the threshold of a one-room hut just outside the walls of a 12th century village. It's winter. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof, and the air inside is thick with smoke and the scent of damp straw. A couple huddles beneath a coarse wool blanket, trying to warm each other. There's no privacy, not when the kids sleep nearby, separated only by a curtain made from old tunics. Still, this is the only space they have, and when the fire burns low, bodies become the last available heat source. Sex, in this setting, is more about survival than romance. The idea of a romantic atmosphere is laughable. There are no scented candles, no mood lighting, and definitely no Marvin Gaye. But despite these conditions, people still find a way. Peasants, especially, are earthy and practical. They don't have the luxury of shame. But above them, in the stone halls of castles and abbeys, the tone is starkly different. You step now into a grand cathedral, where the echo of footsteps is swallowed by centuries of solemn silence. This is the true authority of the time, not the crown, but the church. The church controls your body, your thoughts, and even your bedroom. And it's got opinions. Lots of them. You see, sex wasn't just a private affair. It was a spiritual one. Every act had a time and a purpose, and that purpose was only procreation. Pleasure. Sinful. Fun. Dangerous. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Absolutely not. The medieval calendar was riddled with holy days, fasts, and saintly observances. At one point, nearly half the year was considered off-limits for intimacy. Historians still argue whether this rule was enforced or conveniently ignored by most couples. Either way, the message was clear: you better have a good reason. Now imagine being newly married. You're finally allowed to share a bed legally, and maybe you even love each other, bonus points. But just when things get cozy, your local priest comes knocking for a friendly reminder about the sinfulness of enjoying it. That's right, priests regularly gave sermons that detailed all the many, many wrong ways to engage in marital relations. The list was impressive: wrong time of day, wrong day of the week, wrong position, too much noise, too much joy. Basically, if you smiled, you might be going to hell. One bizarre favorite: the belief that sex was holiest when the couple felt no pleasure at all. That was considered true sacrifice. So if you were a newlywed trying to please your partner and still get into heaven, you were in a bit of a bind. Literally, in some cases, some religious texts described chastity belts, though historians debate whether these were real or just fear-based metaphors. Now, about that bed. You might think of it as a private retreat, but in the Middle Ages, beds were shockingly social. It wasn't uncommon to share a bed with siblings, parents, traveling merchants, or even complete strangers if you stayed at an inn. The idea of a private, couples-only bed was mostly a luxury for the wealthy. And even then, servants were often sleeping nearby, or even in the same room, ready to stoke the fire or fetch water. Privacy. Let's just say it wasn't a medieval virtue. Now imagine lying in bed, whispering to your partner, trying not to giggle, trying not to wake the baby, or the priest in your head reminding you that St. Augustine would be very disappointed in your pelvic enthusiasm. Not exactly sexy. Even conception was theological. Some medieval thinkers, Thomas Aquinas among them, believed that a child's moral standing could be influenced by how it was conceived. A lustful act might produce a sinful child, while a chaste, dutiful union might yield a saint. Historians still argue whether these beliefs actually shaped behavior or simply gave everyone something to feel guilty about. But guilt was the point. If you didn't feel bad about sex, were you even medieval? And yet, human nature is stubborn. People still fell in love, still had affairs, still made bad decisions under moonlight. The difference is, they had to do it under the weight of shame, rules, and fire and brimstone consequences. That tension, between desire and damnation, will follow us all the way through this sleepy, candlelit journey. But for now, you pull the blanket up, shift in the scratchy hay, and sigh. You survived another day without sin. Probably. You wake up before dawn, because, well, everyone does. The rooster crows, your joints creak, and the fire's long gone cold. But in the pale glow of morning, the contrast becomes clear. You stretch your limbs, yawn, and peer out over the hedge dividing the village from the manor. On your side, peasants are beginning their day with muddy feet and quick kisses behind the livestock shed. On the other, noblemen sip watered wine in bed, waiting for someone else to lace their doublets. And somewhere in that divide is how sex feels, raw and unvarnished in the fields, overly choreographed in the castles. Among peasants, sex is messy but real. You're poor, you're cold, and you're tired, but you're also alone with your spouse for 5 whole minutes while the kids run around with the chickens. So, you make it count. Peasant intimacy isn't guided by etiquette books or sermons read aloud by candlelight. It's instinctive and direct. And because you're living on borrowed time, what with famine, plagues, and wars, pleasure becomes its own form of resistance. There's even a strange freedom in being at the bottom. The church may preach modesty, but it's not policing every single haystack. People improvise, and humor thrives. A wink behind the barn, a naughty rhyme shared during ale-making. Sure, someone might mention the sin at confession later, but for now, you're alive, and desire feels holy in its own way. Now step across the threshold into the noble class. Stone floors. Fir throws. Intricate tapestries that hide the draft but not the silence. You're in a bed the size of a modern SUV, draped in velvet, and yet, you've never felt so nervous. Because for the nobles, sex is part performance, part paperwork. Marriage among the upper class isn't about attraction. It's about property, alliances, and producing legitimate heirs. You might be 12. Your spouse might be 30. You might not even speak the same dialect. Doesn't matter. The families agreed, the church blessed it, and now you're stuck with it. And when the moment arrives to consummate the union, you're rarely alone. Let's pause there. Yes, someone might actually be in the room during your first time. The medieval practice of bedding witnesses wasn't just a myth. In some cultures, witnesses stood outside the door listening. In others, they watched you get into bed, sometimes even stayed until things were obviously underway. Not because they were nosy. Well, maybe a little. But mostly because legal and spiritual validity hinged on that one act being properly performed. It's an anxiety-inducing level of scrutiny. You aren't allowed to just fumble around and hope for the best. There are expectations. Rituals. In some French courts, there were even documented performance reviews from servants and attendants. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. Then there's the performance itself. For noblemen, virility was tied to honor. If you couldn't seal the deal, you risked gossip, legal troubles, or worse, a church annulment. For women, the pressure was different. You were expected to be passive, silent, and possibly terrified. Bonus points if you cried. Any display of enjoyment could raise suspicion about your virtue. And heaven forbid you've already been with someone else, that's a whole different nightmare we'll stumble into soon enough. Still, the upper classes had resources. Physicians offered tips. Maids brought warming wine or herbal aphrodisiacs. And the beds? At least they were soft, probably the only part of this situation you genuinely enjoy. But let's not give the peasants too much credit for wild passion, either. Life was hard. Privacy was rare. And pleasure often came second to exhaustion. Most peasants didn't have a bed to themselves until they were well into adulthood, if ever. A couple might sneak away behind the granary, but they'd probably be interrupted by a goat, a gossiping neighbor, or their own kids. And yet, somehow, it all worked. The medieval population didn't exactly dwindle. People found ways to love each other, to touch, to whisper things in the dark that made them feel human. Historians still argue whether peasants had more fulfilling intimate lives than the upper classes. Some say yes, more spontaneity, more affection. Others insist the nobility, for all their constraints, had greater privacy and physical comfort. Of course, all of this varies wildly depending on when and where you are. The 11th century Saxon countryside was not the same as 15th century Florence. Regional customs shaped everything, from wedding ceremonies to foreplay techniques. Yes, foreplay. Some guides for noblewomen actually included tips, though they were often veiled in metaphor. Let him sip from your lips like spring water, for instance. You get the idea. Then there's the social code. In the peasant world, women were usually subordinate but still held practical power, over the household, the garden, the goats, and often, the decision of when the blanket came off. In noble society, women's agency was more limited, but high-born ladies could sometimes leverage their desirability for political advantage. That flirtation at a feast? It might lead to land. You, though, you're stuck somewhere in between. You've seen the raw lust of the village and the performative duty of the court. And neither feels especially relaxing. But tonight, your bed is straw. You're sore from planting turnips. The air is sweet with spring. You're curled next to someone who smells like onion soup and rain. And for a moment, the world's absurd expectations melt away. Until tomorrow, when you'll go back to pretending pleasure is sinful. You kneel on the hard wooden floor of a cold stone chapel. Your hands are folded, but your mind is racing. Not because of a spiritual epiphany, because you're about to confess, once again, that you and your spouse had sex on a Saturday. Yes. That's a sin. So was doing it standing up. Or facing the wrong direction. Or even, depending on your priest, enjoying it too much. Welcome to the bizarre intersection of religion and the bedroom, where every touch might require absolution, and every act of intimacy must pass through the judgment of someone who's sworn never to do it himself. Confession in medieval Europe wasn't just a spiritual check-in, it was a detailed report card on your private life. Church doctrine had an entire taxonomy of sexual sin, and it was the job of the confessor to walk you through it, item by item. There were manuals, literally books that guided priests through every possible, bedroom scenario, often in alarming detail. One 14th century text advised asking married couples whether they had sex while drunk, in daylight, or, gasp, without trying to conceive. You shift uncomfortably as your priest clears his throat and opens the book. You're expected to admit not just that you did it, but how. And why. Did you lust after your spouse, or were you simply obeying your marital duty? That distinction mattered immensely. In the medieval worldview, sex in marriage was tolerable only if it fulfilled your obligation to your spouse, without the distraction of desire. Desire, after all, was dangerous. It clouded judgment, drew the soul toward sin, and, if indulged, might drag you straight to damnation. Some thinkers, like Saint Jerome, claimed that even within marriage, lustful thoughts made the act sinful. Imagine trying to be passionate under that mental fog. Sorry, love, we need to pause, I accidentally imagined your ankles. Of course, not everyone took this so seriously. Many confessions were formulaic, mumbled through out of obligation. But the risk was real. In extreme cases, particularly devout or paranoid priests might assign punishing penances, fasts, pilgrimages, or public shame. Some even recommended abstaining from marital relations altogether for weeks, months, or permanently. Nothing like enforced celibacy to strengthen a union, right? But here's the kicker, the church also required couples to perform their marital duty. If one spouse refused sex without just cause, illness, fasting, or penance, the other could actually appeal to ecclesiastical court. Yes, you could sue your spouse for not sleeping with you. And these courts were shockingly busy. Records show men and women bringing grievances about everything from impotence to being ignored on feast days. So, you had to do it, but not too much. And not the fun way. A delightful little paradox. Historians still argue whether this obsession with confession actually changed behavior. Did people internalize the guilt and self-censor their intimacy? Or did they just nod along, say the prayers, and do whatever they wanted back home? There's evidence for both. In some regions, confessional manuals were ignored and intimacy remained fairly casual. In others, especially during waves of religious revival, anxiety about sex crept into every corner of life. Now picture the awkward conversations in those cramped village confessionals. A young couple, newly married, whispering about their attempts to have a child. The woman quietly admits she wasn't fully focused, she was thinking about the harvest. The priest sighs. That's distraction. A sin. 5 Hail Marys. Or imagine a widow, confessing that she allowed herself to feel pleasure with her new husband. She thought it was love. The priest reminds her it's lust. That's 8 Hail Marys, and maybe a scolding. Even more absurd. Confessing about sex before it happened. Some engaged couples asked their priest how to do it correctly on the wedding night, lest they accidentally invent a new sin. You can't make this up, though frankly, someone probably did. And there were confession loopholes. Wealthier families could sometimes secure more lenient confessors, men who looked the other way, or even offered discreet advice. Others traveled long distances to find priests they didn't know, to avoid the shame of sharing their sins with the neighbor who saw them at the market every week. You roll over in bed, thinking about what to confess next week. Maybe you'll mention that time you kissed your spouse during Lent. Or that you looked at them too long while they bathed. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll leave those out. Say something safer, like, I gossiped, or, I had impure thoughts about bread. There's something painfully ironic about it all. The church, in trying to regulate sex, ended up becoming obsessed with it. Entire clerical careers were spent cataloging every variation of human desire. One French bishop in the 13th century wrote 50 pages on the sinfulness of specific bedroom furniture. Because apparently, a feather mattress made you too comfortable. And let's not forget the poor priests. They were expected to guide married couples through the intricacies of intimacy without ever experiencing it themselves. Many were confused. Some became cynical. A few gave in to temptation and ended up on the other side of the confessional, usually in disgrace. But for you, lying half asleep and staring at the thatched ceiling, it's just another layer of anxiety. You love your partner. You try to follow the rules. But the rules keep shifting. They're written in Latin. And every time you get it wrong, someone in robes reminds you of eternal fire. Still, you whisper goodnight, kiss their forehead, and hope St. Augustine isn't watching. You're getting married tomorrow. You're nervous, yes, but not about the ceremony, or even your new spouse. No, your real fear lies in one crucial, blood-stained detail, the proof. Because here in the Middle Ages, virginity isn't just a virtue, it's a legal matter, a spiritual badge of honor, and a high-stakes gamble for your entire future. And proving it? That's the tricky part. As the wedding bells loom, you lie awake listening to mice scrabble in the rafters and your aunt whispering prayers over your head. Somewhere outside, a cow moos and the moon shifts behind a cloud. But inside your stomach, a knot of anxiety tightens. Because tomorrow night, you'll be expected to leave more than just a memory on the marriage bed, you'll be expected to leave evidence. The obsession with virginity is overwhelming. For women, it defines your worth. For families, it preserves honor. And for the church, it's sacred. Never mind how arbitrary or invasive the whole ordeal is, the doctrine is simple: a woman must be untouched before marriage. Men. Well, it's complicated. Let's just say the double standard is alive and well. You've heard the stories. A white sheet spread across the marital bed. Guests lurking nearby. The next morning, the bloody linen displayed like a victorious battle flag. Sometimes it's paraded through the village. Sometimes it's handed to elders. And sometimes, when the stain is absent, it's the start of something much darker. Because if there's no blood, there are questions. Did you deceive your husband? Was the marriage even valid? Could your husband send you home, or worse, take you to court? Yes, medieval annulments could hinge on this moment. That tiny, red mark could be the difference between life as a wife and life as a shamed exile. But here's the unsettling twist: not all women do bleed. Modern science knows this. Historians today know this. But medieval villagers? Not so much. And so, some women prepared, stashing a bit of chicken blood in a cloth, pricking their finger with a needle, or even faking exhaustion before anyone could inspect the sheets. You do what you must to survive. Historians still argue whether these rituals were practiced universally or only in specific regions. Some suggest the bloodied sheet tradition was more theatrical than regular. Others insist it was standard across large parts of Europe. But one thing is clear: the pressure was real, and the consequences of failure could be devastating. Then there were the tests. Not official ones, necessarily, but whispered assessments and homemade rituals. Some midwives claimed they could see virginity by examining the body. Others believed in tests involving tight-laced bodices or jumping. If you jumped and your feet made a certain sound, you were confirmed. It sounds ridiculous now, and it probably was then too, but when fear and folklore collide, logic isn't invited to the wedding. You try not to think about what might happen if things go wrong. A man scorned on his wedding night might claim fraud. He could demand an annulment, or accuse you of premarital sin. Your family's reputation would be ruined. In some towns, women were publicly humiliated or forced to perform penance just for lacking evidence. There are even records of physical exams performed under church or civic authority, gruesome invasions, all in the name of purity. And for the women who did prove their virginity, it wasn't always a joyful moment. Some brides were paraded around with bloody cloths, their in-laws celebrating like they'd won a tournament. Others were handed coins as rewards. And a few, poor things, were expected to sit up all night with smiling guests who toasted their chastity until dawn. Meanwhile, the groom, he gets to smirk, drink, and pretend he knew it all along. But there are exceptions. In some rare households, the pressure is less intense. A kind husband might brush off the tradition, skip the sheet entirely, and focus instead on making the night gentle and kind. These stories exist. Quietly. They're rarely sung about, but they happened, moments of unexpected tenderness in a world obsessed with blood and proof. Still, the norm is theatrical. Sex becomes a stage. You become the performance. And heaven help you if you flub your lines. Now shift the focus slightly. In noble courts, the pressure on virginity also connects to lineage. If your wife isn't a virgin, your heir might not be yours. This paranoia leads to prenuptial inspections, sworn testimonies, and strict chaperoning before marriage. In one 15th century Italian court, a bride's virginity was vouched for by her wet nurse, her confessor, and 2 family friends. It was practically a team sport. Then there's the myth of the magical hymen. Medieval medical texts described it as a little curtain, a fleshy seal, or even a knot that needed to be broken. One bizarre theory claimed it made a popping sound. Others thought it cried out in pain. You'd laugh if your future didn't depend on people believing these stories. Some scholars think this obsession stemmed from deep-rooted male insecurity. Others point to theological roots: Eve's sin, Mary's virginity, the body as a vessel of spiritual purity. Either way, the result is the same: your body is no longer yours. It's a contract. A test. A symbol. And it's not just women who suffer. There are tales, though fewer, of men being questioned on their wedding night, too. If a nobleman couldn't perform, his wife could take him to court. The famous impotence trials in 16th century France involved medical examinations, courtroom testimonies, and deeply embarrassing physical demonstrations. Picture 5 red-faced nobles arguing over whether a husband's instrument functioned properly. Not ideal pillow talk. But for now, it's the night before. You roll over on your straw mattress, heart racing, fingers clenched in the folds of your linen shift. Tomorrow, you'll smile at the altar. Tomorrow night, you'll be inspected, expected, judged. You whisper a prayer, not for purity, not for pride, but just for peace. Maybe, just maybe, you'll be lucky. The wedding is over. The feast has been eaten, trenchers of barley bread soaked in gravy, a suspiciously tough roast swan, and an almond milk pudding that probably should have stayed in the pot. You've danced the requisite jigs, exchanged awkward toasts, and watched 2 elderly uncles fall asleep in their mead. Now, it's time. The part no one talks about, but everyone is waiting for, the bedding. And no, this is not just you and your spouse sneaking away quietly. This is the public ritual known as the bedding ceremony, and it is as uncomfortable as it sounds. You're marched toward the bedroom, flanked by relatives, friends, a priest, and at least one overly enthusiastic minstrel playing a lute. They're singing something cheerfully obscene, probably with rhyming words like wed and bed and red. You try to smile. You try to breathe. But your heart is pounding like a blacksmith's hammer. At the door, someone pours you a warm drink, usually spiced ale or sweetened wine. It's not for celebration. It's to calm your nerves, because everyone knows what's expected next. They undress you, laughing and joking as they go, as if this were the world's strangest team-building exercise. Sometimes they even lift you onto the bed, arranging you like a display in a shop window. Your spouse is next, disrobed with equal ceremony. Then the priest gives a final blessing. And then, mercifully, they leave. Except, not always. In some regions, a few elders stay behind. They may sit quietly in the corner. Or worse, they hover outside the door, waiting for the sounds of consummation. Some nobles even invite witnesses to ensure the deed is truly done. You're not just having sex, you're performing civic duty. This bizarre tradition isn't just gossip fodder. It's legal documentation. The presence of witnesses helps prove the marriage is real and binding. It may even be required to secure your dowry or inheritance. If you fail to consummate the marriage, your union could be annulled, and in the eyes of the church, it would be as though you were never married at all. So, you're lying there, trembling, possibly tipsy, possibly terrified, wondering how on earth anyone is supposed to feel romantic under these circumstances. You glance at your new spouse. Maybe you've spoken twice before. Maybe they're kind. Maybe they smell like garlic and sweat. Either way, you're both staring at each other like it's a chess match and no one knows the rules. But eventually, the guests do leave. The fire dims. You're alone at last, sort of. The pressure remains. You're meant to do this one very specific thing. And tomorrow, someone will ask if you did. In some traditions, a servant comes to collect the bed sheets in the morning. Others demand that the couple appear at breakfast looking properly disheveled. You hope your hair is messy enough to count. It's all a bit absurd. And yet, for many medieval couples, it's just part of the routine. You've seen your parents' bedding ceremony. Your siblings, your cousins. It's embarrassing, sure, but you endure it, like eating boiled leeks or wearing fur in summer. Some historians argue that the bedding ceremony helped protect women. By making the consummation public knowledge, it prevented husbands from later claiming the marriage was never real. Others say it reinforced patriarchal control, reducing intimacy to a legal checkpoint. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. The ceremony varied widely across Europe. In some German regions, the whole village got involved, throwing socks, singing songs, even banging pots and pans outside the couple's window. In parts of England, they called it the hurling of the stocking, where guests literally flung hosiery at the newlyweds. France had its own flair, including poetry, blessings, and a good deal of ribald humor. And in Scandinavian villages, it wasn't uncommon for the bride's mother to stay in the room until things got started. Try relaxing with that on your conscience. You roll over, trying to make sense of it all. Somewhere beyond the window, someone shouts a cheer. Another cup is raised in your honor. And you just want to sleep. But even after the bedding, there's more. In the following days, people will watch how you walk. If you wince, they'll nudge each other knowingly. If you smile too much, they'll assume the groom's a stallion. Privacy is a myth. Your bedroom becomes community property, your body a symbol of honor and compliance. And then there's the documentation. Nobles often record the consummation in legal texts. Kings and queens have their bedding ceremonies painted, written, and sung about. It's theater, gossip, legacy, all wrapped into one sweaty, awkward night. If you were lucky, it was quick. If you were luckier, it was kind. If you were very lucky, you and your spouse even shared a laugh. And if not, well, at least the chicken was decent. Still, as the embers die out and the noises from the feast fade into memory, you lie in the dim room and wonder, will this be what love is now? Will every act be observed, documented, judged? For some, it is. For others, love grows slowly, under blankets and behind closed shutters. But tonight, love isn't the goal. Legitimacy is. And tomorrow, they'll ask about the sheets. The morning sun slices through the wooden shutters, catching the corner of your eye. Your head pounds a little, not from the wine, but from the sheer tension of surviving your own wedding night. You stretch, yawn, and then remember, someone's probably already inspected the sheets. But now, as you blink away the sleep and wrap yourself in a woolen cloak, another world opens up, one with dried herbs hanging from the rafters, suspicious vials tucked under the bed, and a few whispers about how to make, or unmake, desire. Welcome to the clandestine corner of medieval love, the world of potions, charms, and herbal lust. In a time when sex was both feared and controlled, people still craved agency over their bodies and their feelings. And so, they turned to plants, powders, and potions. Want someone to fall in love with you? There's a tincture for that. Want to cool your passions during Lent? Also covered. Hoping to improve performance on your wedding night? Ask the local wise woman, if you can find her. You walk through the market square, dodging geese and the occasional runaway pig, and pause at a modest stall. A toothless old woman offers bundles of dried yarrow and crushed anise. Nothing too scandalous, unless you know the code. You whisper your need. She raises an eyebrow, then slips you a tiny pouch of fennel wine and powdered turnip seed, rumored to spark desire in even the most pious monk. The medieval world didn't have Viagra, but it had plenty of alternatives. Aphrodisiacs were everywhere, pine nuts, cinnamon, artichokes, and oysters, to name a few. Even roasted ants were considered useful, though you'd have to be fairly desperate, or daring, to try that. And then there's one standout, mandrake root. Mandrake wasn't just a Harry Potter prop. This gnarled, humanoid-shaped root was believed to scream when pulled from the earth and to bring fertility, or death, depending on how it was used. Some swore by its power to enhance passion. Others feared its curse. Either way, it had a place in love lore, tucked into satchels beneath mattresses or brewed into dangerously potent teas. Of course, not every love potion was romantic. Some were about control. Jealous wives might slip herbs into their husbands' drinks to make them more loyal. Nervous grooms might seek concoctions to ensure they could perform. And heartbroken villagers might pay dearly for just one more night of remembered passion, real or imagined. Historians still argue how widespread these practices were. Some say herbal aphrodisiacs were common folk remedies, passed down from mother to daughter. Others claim they were fringe behaviors, associated with the shadowy edge of society, healers, midwives, and yes, accused witches. Because make no mistake, playing with lust could get you in serious trouble. The Church condemned love potions as sinful, even demonic. Using them was considered tampering with God's will. Some texts called them a gateway to sorcery. You didn't just risk excommunication, you risked trial. And yet, the demand never disappeared. Why? Because people are people. No matter how much fire and brimstone is preached from the pulpit, someone, somewhere, is trying to spice things up in the bedroom. Even among clergy, interest in these substances existed, if only for the purpose of condemning them. Monastic texts list aphrodisiacs in suspiciously great detail. One 13th-century friar even compiled a list of dangerous vegetables that might inflame the loins: carrots, onions, parsnips. Essentially, your entire winter soup. But it wasn't just about starting passion. It was about stopping it, too. Chastity brews, herbal blends meant to suppress desire, were sometimes administered to monks and nuns. Rue, sage, and willow bark were among the usual suspects. Did they work? Probably not. But drinking boiled leaves as a preventative measure tells you just how far people went to control the unpredictable beast of lust. You wander back to your cottage and pass a young couple. The girl giggles and tugs the boy's sleeve. He hands her a sprig of basil. You might smile, but basil was believed to inspire affection and fidelity. A humble love charm. And then there's the amulets. Medieval people loved to wear their wishes around their necks. A dried frog's tongue in a pouch might attract affection. A scrap of parchment with a saint's name could guard against sinful thoughts. One noblewoman supposedly wore a gold ring inscribed with a Latin prayer to cool the fires of the womb. What a fashion statement. Of course, not all of this was secret. Some of it was shared, whispered, even sung. Folk songs taught village girls how to recognize certain plants. Nursery rhymes passed on knowledge disguised as riddles. Rosemary for remembering, thyme for desire, you get the picture. And if the herbs didn't work? Well, you could always try magic. That's where things get dicey. The line between herbal medicine and sorcery was razor thin. If your charm succeeded, you were lucky. If it failed, or worse, if someone got jealous, you might be accused of witchcraft. You could find yourself in front of a bishop explaining why your love potion didn't respect the church calendar. Still, you hide your sachet beneath the straw mattress. You light a candle. You sip a warm drink that tastes vaguely like licorice and regret. And you wait. Not for fireworks, but for warmth, for closeness, for something just human enough to feel like magic. Because in a world that made desire sinful and love political, even the simplest herb could feel like hope. It's a quiet night. You sit by the hearth, pretending to mend a sock while the wind hisses through the shutters. But your mind is somewhere else, haunted by the warnings you heard in church last Sunday. The priest's voice still echoes, the devil walks with lust in his eyes. And just like that, we've entered the fear-fueled heart of the Middle Ages, where forbidden lusts were not just personal matters, but public panics. The church didn't merely frown at desire. It waged a full-scale moral war against it. From fiery sermons to thick theological treatises, lust was portrayed not just as a weakness, but as a demonic force, one that could turn good Christians into beasts, or worse, into sinners who loved their sins. You stir the embers. Somewhere in town, a man has been accused of sleeping with his neighbor's wife. There's talk of him being put in stocks. But the whispers go further. Someone claims he cavorted with demons in the shape of women. Succubi. That's the word. It slips from lip to lip like spoiled wine. Yes, succubi and incubi. The church taught that demons could tempt humans into sin by appearing in the form of seductive men or women. These spirits would creep into your bedroom at night, inflame your thoughts, and steal your seed, or your soul. Lust wasn't just a sin. It was a supernatural ambush. Some theologians genuinely believe this happened. There are recorded confessions from terrified villagers who claimed they were visited by beautiful strangers in the dark, only to wake up alone, shivering, and ashamed. Historians still argue whether these tales were dreams, sleep paralysis, or something else. But the fear? That was real. And the forbidden didn't stop at demons. The church catalogued every unnatural act it could imagine. Masturbation, sin, homosexuality, grave sin, bestiality, utter abomination. In some manuals, these acts were arranged in charts, ranked by severity, like a grim medieval version of a sin buffet. The penalties? Severe. Some confessed and were whipped. Others were paraded through town with signs describing their crime. A few, especially in later centuries, were burned. And yet, these acts persisted, because of course they did. You can ban behavior, but you can't erase human nature. Back in your village, everyone knows someone who got caught. The shepherd boy who lingered too long in the fields. The widow who was too friendly with her maid. They all walk with lowered eyes now, some paying penance, others clinging to secrecy. And then there are the accusations, half witch hunt, half neighborhood drama. A woman refuses a marriage proposal. Suddenly, she's accused of using a charm to inflame the heart of another. A man is too affectionate with his dog. Whispers start. One 14th century case in France involved a man accused of inappropriate acts with a goat. The poor animal was also put on trial. Yes, the goat. You might laugh, but back then, it was deadly serious. Animals were sometimes executed for being willing participants in sin. People genuinely believed that moral disorder could infect the very fabric of the world, and sexual transgression was the most infectious of all. This paranoia even reached into marriage. A couple could be reprimanded for being too affectionate. If someone suspected them of engaging in a non-sanctioned position, or worse, enjoying it, they might be called before the priest. Inquisitive neighbors meant that privacy was practically a myth. Even the rhythm of your mattress could raise suspicion. And yet, behind closed doors, people still kissed. Still giggled. Still risked everything for a stolen moment in the shadows. Forbidden lust wasn't always scandalous, it was often just human. Take the story of a young monk and a village girl. He preaches during Lent, she brings him eggs. Over time, their hands linger too long. She blushes. He hesitates. One night, they meet near the well. It's foolish, dangerous, sinful, but also tender. He's discovered. She's blamed. He's sent to a harsher monastery. She's forced to confess weekly for a year. But years later, someone swears they saw them walking together, gray-haired and still holding hands. The truth is, not all forbidden lusts were evil. Some were just inconvenient to the people in charge. Still, it's dangerous. Even suspicion can ruin a life. And with every sermon, the church reminds you, desire is a crack in your soul that lets the devil in. Some even believe demons breed with humans. That sinful sex can produce monstrous children. Entire village legends grow from these tales, babies with tails, women giving birth to snakes, men cursed to howl at the moon. Fear has always been fertile ground for folklore. So you pull your cloak tighter. The fire dies. The wind howls louder. And somewhere in the dark, you wonder, what is sin, really? Is it the act? The thought? The fear of being caught? You whisper a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for clarity. Because deep down, you know the difference between love and lust, right and wrong. The problem is, the church might not agree with you. And until it does, you'll keep your secrets tucked away, like herbs under a floorboard. You're at the market again, pretending to be interested in cabbages. But your ears are wide open. Behind the cart, two women are talking, not about crops, but about that woman. The one who left her husband. Or maybe he left her. The details shift, but the judgment doesn't. In this world, once your marriage breaks, your reputation follows close behind. Because here's the thing, sex and marriage weren't just entwined in the Middle Ages, they were fused, legally, socially, and spiritually. And when that bond shattered, the fallout wasn't just emotional. It was legalistic, public, and often very, very ugly. In medieval Europe, marriage was never just about love. It was a sacrament, yes, but also a contract, a political tool, and a religious duty. You weren't just joining hearts, you were combining land, families, dowries, and expectations. And breaking that contract? Not easily done. You trudge home past the chapel and glance at the church doors. That's where many marriages were blessed, right on the steps. No elaborate reception hall. Just a priest, some parchment, and a whole lot of witnesses, some of whom were mostly there to make sure you weren't marrying someone you'd already had a child with. Scandal has a long memory. But once you're married, your body isn't yours anymore. The church called it the marital debt. Each spouse owed the other sex, on demand, within reason. If your husband asked, you couldn't say no. If your wife asked, well, theoretically the same applied. Denial without cause was a sin. Chronic refusal. Grounds for annulment. Historians still debate how strictly this was enforced. In noble households, it was a tool of control, used in court to dissolve unions or secure new ones. In villages, it was often more informal, but no less binding. People genuinely believed that denying your spouse could offend God. Which made it complicated when someone just wasn't interested. And yet, despite all the doctrine, marriages still fell apart. Let's say your spouse turns violent. Or sterile. Or distant. What then? In theory, annulments were possible. The church could declare your marriage null, as if it had never existed. But to qualify, you needed the right reasons: consanguinity, too closely related, prior vows, like secret holy orders, impotence, usually the man's, or lack of consent. You'd think that would be rare, but noble courts saw plenty of annulment requests. In some cases, the arguments were elaborate. One 14th century lady claimed her husband was so cold he was more ice than man. Another swore he turned into a beast by moonlight. Was she serious? Probably not. But it worked. He was exiled. She remarried. More disturbingly, impotence trials were a real thing. A wife could accuse her husband of being unable to fulfill his duties. He, in turn, had to prove otherwise, in front of physicians, sometimes even in court. There are records of men being examined by panels, asked to demonstrate function in terrifyingly public ways. You'd think pride would stop it, but land and legacy were on the line. Honor could be medically verified. Meanwhile, if a woman was accused of being too passionate, or not passionate enough, she could be labeled unnatural, unfeminine, or worse, unfaithful. A man could accuse his wife of adultery and, if successful, have her punished or imprisoned. A woman could accuse her husband of the same, but unless he brought shame to the family or gave his mistress gifts from the household purse, it was often ignored. Some women found clever ways around this imbalance. One noblewoman in Milan staged a faux conversion to a life of piety, claiming holy visions told her to flee her marriage. Her husband tried to drag her back. The bishop took her side. She joined a convent, and wrote scandalous poetry for the next 10 years. Respect. But for most women, there were no such exits. Marriage was permanent. Your body belonged to someone else. And even if they never touched you again, that tie was spiritual, legal, and economic. And let's not forget widowhood, a strange form of freedom. Once your husband died, you could finally own property, make decisions, or even refuse to remarry. Some widows wore black until the end of their days, not out of grief, but out of stubborn autonomy. They'd done their duty. They weren't doing it again. Of course, some did remarry. For love. For security. For the children. But they did it with eyes wide open. No illusions this time, just survival. You walk past the widow's cottage on your way home. She's tending her garden alone, her hair unbound. Some say she's a witch. Others say she's just clever. You nod politely. She nods back. No one asks her if she misses him. Back inside, you think about your own marriage. It isn't perfect. But it functions. You do your duty. You share a roof, a bed, a silence. And sometimes, when the candlelight hits just right, you even laugh together. Because in the end, marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't always about love. But love still found its way in, between the contracts and the rituals, the sermons and the debts. It bloomed quietly, like a wildflower in a field of laws. And if it didn't? Well, there was always basil under the pillow. It's nearly harvest time, and the village is buzzing with anxious energy. The carts creak under sheaves of wheat, children chase hens through dusty alleys, and you're noticing something unusual. There are a lot of very pregnant women right now. It seems like everyone is expecting. That's no coincidence. Because sex in medieval times didn't just end with the bedding ceremony, it often ended with a baby. Or several. Or heartbreak. You rub your hands together and watch a neighbor woman waddle past, one hand on her swollen belly, the other gripping a basket of turnips. She's smiling. She's lucky. Pregnancy is, quite literally, a gamble with your life. Let's start with the obvious. There was no reliable birth control. And yet, that didn't stop people from trying. The village midwife might have passed on some tips. Wild carrot seed, pennyroyal tea, or rue boiled in wine, herbal remedies that, according to folk belief, might prevent conception. Some of them probably didn't work. Others might have. And a few were outright dangerous. Take pennyroyal, taken in the wrong dose, it could poison you faster than it could stop a pregnancy. Historians still argue how widespread these methods were. Some say women knew more about their bodies than we give them credit for, passing knowledge in whispers and coded recipes. Others argue most contraception was ineffective, and childbearing was constant. In truth, it varied. But one fact is hard to ignore: most women spent their adult lives either pregnant, recovering from birth, or mourning a lost child. And then there's the taboo topic, abortion. Yes, it existed. And yes, it was practiced. Quietly. Carefully. Often under the guise of restoring the menses. Church authorities condemned it, but early on, they made a distinction: if it happened before quickening, when the mother could feel the baby move, it was considered less serious. Later, the rules tightened. But by then, the knowledge had already taken root. You sit by the fire and think about what it must be like, carrying a child in a world with no ultrasounds, no antibiotics, no pain relief beyond a strong ale and a bite of leather. Pregnancy was less a miracle than a test of endurance. And yet, women kept doing it. Because family meant survival. Because children were future hands on the plow. Because marriage required heirs. Because, sometimes, love insisted. But childbirth? That was a battle. The average medieval woman gave birth at home, surrounded by other women, midwives, mothers, sisters, and neighbors. No doctors, no men, no priests. This was a female domain. The midwife, often older and wise from years of experience, was both savior and surgeon. She carried herbs, holy relics, and a bucket of warm water. She'd whisper prayers and offer a carved birthing stone for the mother to grip. And still, many didn't make it. Infections were common. Hemorrhaging was fatal. Breech births were nearly impossible to fix. One wrong turn and both mother and child could be lost. It's estimated that 1 in 3 women died from childbirth-related causes in parts of medieval Europe. That number isn't just chilling, it's personal. Every birth carried the weight of possible death. You pause, remembering the wooden carving in the church, the Virgin Mary, swollen with child, serene and distant. She's held up as the perfect mother, pure, holy, uncomplaining. No one talks about the fear she might have felt. But real mothers? They prepared in practical ways. They confessed before labor. They had their last rites read, just in case. Some even had burial shrouds laid out before the first contraction. You never knew which breath would be your last. And yet, amidst the risk, there was also community. The women who came together during birth formed tight bonds, gossip guilds, in some regions. The word gossip originally meant a woman who witnessed your child's baptism. They shared secrets, helped raise the child, and supported one another through endless cycles of life and death. And once the baby arrived, the rituals continued. Baptism had to happen quickly, sometimes within hours, because if the baby died unbaptized, their soul was believed to wander in limbo. No heaven. No reunion. Just eternal waiting. It's why some women carried their still-warm newborns through storms to the church, weeping, pleading with the priest to hurry. Sometimes, priests refused. Sometimes, desperate women baptized the child themselves, hoping it was enough. You think of that now, watching your cousin cradle her newborn. She smiles, but you see the worry behind her eyes. Will the child survive winter? Will her milk come in? Will her body recover? There were charms for that, too. Mothers tucked protective amulets into cradles, tiny crosses, scraps of psalm verses, or even wolf's teeth, believed to ward off evil spirits. The line between religion and folklore blurred quickly when a baby's life was at stake. And if a child did die, the grief was sharp. But in many cases, unspoken. Infant mortality was high, nearly half of all children didn't make it to age 5. Parents learned to grieve quietly, to love cautiously. Some never named the child until after the baptism. Others gave every child the same name, over and over again, in the hopes that this one would live. You close your eyes and imagine a woman somewhere in the next village, holding her 5th baby, named Thomas, after the 4 before him who didn't make it. She sings to him anyway. In the end, medieval sex and marriage weren't about pleasure. They were about survival. About legacy. About bringing life into a world that didn't always welcome it kindly. But even so, when that baby grasped a finger, when a tired mother whispered her child's name for the first time, something sacred happened. Not the church's kind of sacred. The human kind. And for a moment, the world was worth it. You're standing in a field at dusk, watching the smoke from a distant hearth curl into the pinkening sky. Somewhere, a dog barks. A cow bellows. And from the woods, laughter, quick, nervous, unmistakable. Two lovers, hiding where no one can see. Or so they hope. Because despite all the sermons, all the punishments, all the contracts and holy laws, people still had sex outside of marriage. Quite a lot of it, actually. And while the church tried to control desire, desire often slipped right through the cracks of custom and discipline. We call it fornication now, such a tidy, old-fashioned word. But in the Middle Ages, it was more than just a term. It was a legal category. A social sin. And sometimes, a public event. You might imagine a strict and pious world where every act of intimacy was regulated or punished. And that was certainly the ideal the church pushed. But medieval people were still human. People loved in secret. They had affairs. They snuck off behind barns. They found each other in kitchens, stables, pilgrim roads, and summer festivals. Unmarried couples, especially those too poor to marry, often engaged in handfasting, an informal promise to wed. Some took it seriously. Others used it as an excuse. You'd declare yourselves husband and wife, live together, even have children. Sometimes, the church eventually caught up and made it official. Other times, it didn't. And occasionally, these arrangements collapsed, and the consequences fell hardest on the woman. Because, let's be honest, when an unmarried woman got pregnant, her life changed instantly. The shame? Heavy. The risk? Enormous. In small communities, everyone noticed. The belly grew. The whispers followed. If she named the father, he might deny it, or offer hush money. If she refused to name him, the church might accuse her of hiding a scandal. Sometimes, the town punished both parties with public penance. But other times, the man walked free, and she bore the burden alone. In some places, unmarried mothers were forced to stand barefoot in church, holding their child, while confessing before the whole congregation. Others had to wear shame badges, patches sewn to their clothes, or special cloaks that marked them as fallen. And yet, despite the disgrace, these women often returned to work, raised their children, and built quiet lives on the margins. Historians still debate how cruel these punishments really were. In some villages, the shame faded quickly. In others, it clung like smoke. It all depended on class, community, and just how loudly the priest liked to preach. And what about the fathers? That's the tricky part. If the father was rich or powerful, he might pay to keep the matter quiet. If he was poor, he might vanish. And if he wasn't the father, but happened to be her betrothed, he might call off the wedding. Or worse, accuse her of seduction. But sometimes, the man stood by her. Married her anyway. Named the child. These stories are rare, but they mattered. They gave people hope. You hear them whispered at night, the way fairy tales are told to children not to entertain them, but to give them something to hold on to. The church, of course, tried to suppress all this. Priests preached fiery sermons about carnal temptation. Confession booths echoed with guilty admissions. Moral handbooks listed the sins of the flesh in exhausting detail, everything from holding hands too long to thinking about someone else during marital duty. There were even taxes. Yes, really. In some areas, fines were levied against those caught fornicating. The church turned sin into revenue. You sinned, you paid, you prayed, and the cycle repeated. And yet, brothels thrived. Especially in cities like Paris, London, or Florence, prostitution was not only common, it was regulated. Town officials licensed brothels, controlled their location, and sometimes even took a cut of the profits. Some cities assigned red belts or colored veils so clients could identify working women. Others kept the brothels near ports or markets, away from churches and respectable homes. It was a strange balance. The church condemned prostitution as sinful, a necessary evil, they called it. But secular leaders often tolerated it. Why? Because they believed it protected good women. Better to have a few damned souls in brothels, they reasoned, than to have temptation threatening their wives and daughters. The lives of these women were hard. Many were former servants, abandoned lovers, or desperate widows. Some entered the trade by choice. Others were coerced. A few became successful madams, managing houses with rigid discipline. But most lived in the shadows, desirable, condemned, essential, and forgotten. One chronicler tells of a prostitute who died during a plague in Avignon. No priest would bury her. No church would take her. So the townspeople, quietly, respectfully, buried her themselves. Her name was never recorded. But her grave was marked with wildflowers every spring. And then there were clandestine relationships, especially among the clergy. You weren't supposed to notice, but monks had lovers. Priests fathered children. Nuns met secret visitors through garden doors. These scandals were well known, often joked about, and occasionally punished. But many were simply overlooked. A priest with one mistress might be fined. A priest with 3 might be transferred. You see the pattern. Which brings us back to you, wandering the woods, catching sight of those 2 lovers hiding behind the trees. They'll pretend nothing happened. They'll return to the village separately. But tonight, they shared something the church will never fully understand. Because while the medieval world tried to control sex with sermons, shame, and statutes, desire always found a way. It hid in songs. It danced at harvest festivals. It flickered in candles. It whispered in corners. And sometimes, just sometimes, it bloomed quietly in the dark, without permission, without punishment, without regret. You're in the city now, narrow streets, towers of timber and stone, 1,000 scents wafting through the air, baked bread, horse sweat, and something less pleasant from the nearby ditch. But you're not here for the view. You're watching a group of people clustered outside a building marked by a strange symbol. It's not a church. It's not a shop. It's a public bathhouse, and in medieval times, that's where things got steamy. Let's step into the foggy world of medieval bathing culture, where cleanliness met closeness, and a hot soak wasn't just about hygiene, it was sometimes about something else entirely. You might be surprised to hear that many medieval towns had public bathhouses, especially in the earlier Middle Ages. Inspired by Roman traditions, these were often large, communal, and surprisingly well-equipped, hot pools, cold plunges, scented oils, and towels woven from linen. In cities like Paris, Nuremberg, and London, bathhouses dotted the neighborhoods, their steam rising above rooftops on cool evenings. They were known by charming names like the Swan, the Blue Door, or, more suggestively, the stew. That last one stuck. Stew houses became the go-to term for these places. You'd pay a small fee, disrobe, and soak in shared wooden tubs alongside your neighbors. Sometimes, men and women bathed together. Other times, the genders were separated by days or hours. But in either case, the bathhouse quickly became a social hotspot. You're reclining in a warm tub of rose-scented water, surrounded by murmuring voices. Someone's getting a foot massage in the corner. Two merchants are discussing grain prices while a baker rinses flour from his beard. There's laughter, splashing, and beneath it all, a flirtatious tension. Because while many people went to bathhouses for relaxation or hygiene, others went looking for company. Intimate company. Some bathhouses were discreetly affiliated with prostitution. You might bathe with someone who offered you a little more than soap. Others employed bathing girls or attendants who helped scrub your back, some fully professional, others more generous in their services. The line between hospitality and eroticism blurred easily in a steamy room. Was it legal? Sometimes. Was it condemned? Often. Did it stop anyone? Not even close. Church authorities tried to shut down bathhouses repeatedly. They called them dens of sin, places where lust festered and temptation ran rampant. They weren't entirely wrong. But the bathhouses had defenders, too. City officials argued that they promoted cleanliness, prevented disease, and offered public health benefits. And besides, everyone used them, merchants, nobles, priests, widows, even visiting royalty. One famous German emperor, Henry IV, was known to hold meetings while soaking in bathhouses. Diplomats would sit waist-deep in water as they negotiated treaties, trying not to wrinkle their scrolls. It was politics in the nude. Still, scandal lingered. Historians still debate how sexual these spaces truly were. Some insist that most bathhouses were innocent, just places to wash off the day's grime. Others believe they served as safe havens for illicit rendezvous, same-sex meetings, and quiet moments between forbidden lovers. The answer? Likely both. It depended on the town, the time, and the crowd. As public opinion began to sour, especially in the wake of outbreaks like the Black Death, bathing fell out of favor. People began to associate water with illness. Some doctors even claimed that soaking opened your pores to plague vapors. The church agreed. Bathhouses were shut down or repurposed. Modesty took over, and people started bathing less. But while the public bathhouse faded, the memory of it lingered, warm, scandalous, and foggy. Still, not everyone gave up bathing. In wealthier homes, private tubs were filled with water carried in buckets from the fire. Scented oils masked body odors, and cloths soaked in vinegar became substitutes for full immersion. And, of course, bedroom rituals evolved to include their own kind of preparation. Imagine a noblewoman, seated at her dressing table. Her maid sprinkles lavender on her sleeves. She dabs rosewater behind her ears. A silver comb glides through her hair. This isn't just vanity, it's courtship. Cleanliness becomes flirtation. Perfume becomes invitation. And men. They might chew herbs to freshen their breath, dust their undergarments with powdered cloves, or wear fine linen to bed. One courtly guidebook even advises men to trim their beards, so they do not bristle like the hog. Sage advice. Cleanliness was not just health, it was seduction. And now, back in the bathhouse, you overhear a couple whispering. He reaches for her hand under the water. She laughs softly, eyes darting to see who's watching. A splash. A glance. And then, nothing more. They leave separately, wrapped in wool cloaks, steam rising behind them like a curtain. You towel off, feeling oddly refreshed. The bath has worked its magic. Your skin glows, your limbs relax, and for a fleeting moment, the harshness of medieval life melts away. And that's the thing about bathhouses, they offered escape. From filth, from rules, from loneliness. In a world of rigid roles and endless rules, a hot bath could be the closest thing to freedom. Until someone told you it was a sin again. The city gates close behind you with a wooden groan as you make your way down a dusty road that snakes through farmland, village, and chapel. You pass a group of pilgrims headed in the opposite direction. One clutches a staff, another a flask of ale, and one man grins as he offers a wink to a nun trailing behind. She doesn't look amused. Or maybe she does. Because not all was celibate behind cloister walls. Tonight, we turn down the candlelight and tiptoe through the whispered halls of monastic desire, the kind hidden under robes, behind confessionals, and deep in the folds of spiritual discipline. You see, in theory, monks and nuns were married not to each other, but to God. Their vows were strict: poverty, obedience, and yes, chastity. They lived in cloisters, rose in the dark to pray, copied manuscripts by day, and slept in silence at night. Their lives were meant to be beyond fleshly things. But reality, as always, had other plans. Monasteries were isolated, yes, but they were also full of people. Young people. Lonely people. And while sermons warned against carnal sin, those same monks and nuns still had bodies. They still dreamed. They still remembered what it meant to touch, or be touched. Some resisted with every ounce of will. Others didn't. There are stories, buried deep in dusty chronicles, about nuns who bore children in secret, monks who were discovered sneaking out after curfew, even entire convents accused of immoral behavior. One abbess in 14th century France reportedly ran her nunnery like a courtly salon, poetry, love letters, and passionate entanglements hidden behind high stone walls. And the monks? They wrote. Oh, they wrote. Some of the most vividly romantic, even erotic, poetry of the Middle Ages came from men who had taken vows of chastity. Historians still argue whether this was all metaphorical, devotion to the divine, or something more personal, more confessional. You thumb through a faded parchment in your mind's eye. A monk writes of longing that burns like the sun in my flesh. Is it for God? For a woman? A fellow brother? It's unclear. But the ache is real. One monk, John of Fécamp, wrote of struggling with impure thoughts during prayer. He begged for forgiveness. He fasted. He flogged himself. Yes, flagellation was a common penance, both symbolic and literal. Some monks believed physical suffering could kill desire. Others simply passed out. And still, temptations crept in. The abbey wasn't immune to fantasy. There were dreams, touches, stolen glances in the scriptorium. Some monks confessed to desiring one another, forming intense emotional bonds, sometimes called spiritual friendships. Were these platonic? Some, yes. Others strayed into more dangerous territory. Not all were subtle. One notorious monk in 15th century England reportedly kept a mistress in the cloister's attic. He bribed the porter with cheese and ale to keep her hidden. Eventually, the ruse fell apart, and both were punished, she sent to a distant convent, he to manual labor under the watch of a very stern abbot. And then there are the stories that blend piety with sensuality in ways that still confuse modern readers. Saint Lutgardes of Aiguillers, a 13th-century mystic, wrote of her spiritual union with Christ in intensely physical language, describing visions of being embraced, kissed, even entering into his wounds. Was it metaphor? Was it mysticism? Scholars still debate it. But perhaps the most infamous account is that of the nun's priest's tale, no, not Chaucer's version, but a real 14th-century court record of a nun who became pregnant and claimed she was visited by the Archangel Gabriel. The inquisitors were unimpressed. She was excommunicated. But the tale lived on in bawdy verse and backroom gossip. Of course, not every monk or nun broke their vows. Many lived with fierce discipline, finding purpose in prayer and peace in solitude. But even they struggled. One Carthusian monk confessed in his journal that every spring, as flowers bloomed, so did his thoughts. He longed for silence within himself, but the body had other plans. To resist, monastics developed coping mechanisms. Cold baths. Hard labor. Long hours of fasting. They slept in narrow cells with coarse sheets, sometimes even on the floor. Meals were bland. Conversations limited. The senses dulled to protect the soul. And yet, temptation always returned, proof, perhaps, that desire is not an evil to be crushed, but a force to be understood. You pass a crumbling priory, vines twisting through its stone walls. The chapel roof is gone, but inside, a single altar stands. You wonder who once knelt there, what secrets they whispered, what guilt they carried, what small rebellions lived behind their closed eyes. Because even in the most sacred places, the line between purity and passion was fragile. And sometimes, behind those cloistered doors, the most powerful confessions weren't to God, but to one another. You're back in the village now, seated near a tavern where the fire crackles low and tankards clink softly in the hands of tired laborers. Behind you, two old men are chuckling over a crude story about a knight, a goose, and a very confused milkmaid. You can't help but smile, because tonight's lesson is this: medieval people had a sense of humor about sex. A vivid one. A bawdy one. And sometimes, a downright shocking one. In a world weighed down by rules, war, famine, and sermons, people still laughed. And they laughed a lot about the one topic no priest wanted to mention from the pulpit, but everyone secretly thought about. Sex. You sip your imaginary ale and lean closer. You're about to hear tales that would have made a nun blush, or chuckle, depending on her mood. Let's start with fabliaux, a medieval genre of short, humorous, and often very naughty tales told in verse. These were wildly popular from the 12th to 14th centuries, especially in France and later in England. They were performed by jongleur and minstrels in courts, taverns, or fairs, delivered with winks, raised eyebrows, and probably more pelvic thrusts than necessary. The characters: lecherous priests, gullible husbands, lusty wives, clever servants, and the occasional talking animal. The plots: full of tricks, disguises, mistaken identities, and, of course, bedroom mishaps. In one classic fabliau, a woman tricks two suitors into sleeping with each other by blindfolding them and claiming to be in two places at once. In another, a foolish man hides in a bread oven to spy on his cheating wife, only to get roasted himself, figuratively and nearly literally. What's wild is not just that these stories existed, but that they were popular across all social classes. Nobles laughed. Peasants howled. Even monks wrote them down in the margins of more respectable texts. Imagine flipping through a Bible and finding a doodle of a nun chasing a monk with a sausage on a stick. It happened. A lot. Because marginalia, the little illustrations scribbled into medieval manuscripts, are a goldmine of unexpected filth. There are monks mooning each other. A knight fighting a snail, with suspicious symbolism. A fox in a nun's habit chasing geese. A man playing bagpipes with his backside. It's as if the scribe spent hours copying solemn Latin texts and thought, you know what this needs. But jokes. Historians still argue whether these were acts of rebellion, boredom, or just creative release. Some even believe they were moral warnings in disguise. But you know better. They were giggles in ink, proof that even holy men had dirty minds from time to time. And then there's Chaucer. You can't talk about medieval sexual humor without tipping your cap to the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's stories are packed with desire, deception, and double entendres. The Miller's Tale alone involves a man kissing someone's rear end out of a window, and another getting a red-hot poker where the sun doesn't shine. What makes it more delicious? These tales were told by pilgrims. People supposedly on a holy journey. Which, of course, made it even funnier. But the laughter didn't stay on the page. Medieval festivals, especially Carnival and May Day, were excuses for outrageous behavior. Social roles were reversed. Priests were mocked. Foolish kings were crowned. And sexual jokes flowed like wine. Some towns held mock weddings between animals. Others staged dirty plays with masked characters acting out lustful farces. The church grumbled. The people laughed. Even magic and superstition got the cheeky treatment. Love spells, for example, were often absurdly specific. Write his name on your thigh with goose fat and say this rhyme thrice. Or, bury a pear under the full moon while wearing no undergarments. Some were meant sincerely. Others were jokes passed around for fun. But everyone knew someone who swore it worked. And how about medieval slang? You thought modern euphemisms were creative? The Middle Ages had a whole catalogue of suggestive language. He went to plough her field. She unlocked the monk's cloister. He played the harp between her thighs. Even tools weren't safe. One Old English poem refers to a man's genitals as his hanging spade. Poetic? Slightly. Subtle. Not even close. Let's not forget the carvings in churches, yes, churches. Grotesques, gargoyles, and roof bosses sometimes depicted men exposing themselves, women lifting their skirts, or couples mid-act. Scholars argue these were warnings, symbols of sin, or protective talismans. Maybe. Or maybe the stonecutters just had a long lunch and a twisted sense of humor. You lean back and look around the tavern. The laughter is real. The fire is warm. And for a moment, the worries of life, plague, taxes, moral failure, fade away. Because that's what humor does. It heals. In a world so often marked by fear, of death, of God, of judgment, laughter was resistance. A way to say, yes, we're mortal, but at least we can laugh about it. And when it came to sex, the Middle Ages weren't silent. They were snickering. So the next time you hear that medieval folks were all grim-faced prudes wrapped in burlap and gilt, remember the talking butt snail. Remember the fabliaux. And remember the monk who doodled a chicken dancing on a lute. Even in the most pious times, the human spirit has a way of slipping out for a chuckle. You wake before dawn, the air thick with mist and the chill of early morning dew. Somewhere beyond the fields, a rooster crows like it owns the universe. Today, you're heading to the edge of town, not to the market, not to the fields, but to the place where sins are judged. Because it's time we talked about what happened when medieval people didn't just break the rules of sexuality, but got caught. Because for all the quiet indulgences, hidden romances, and whispered trysts we've explored, the truth is, medieval society punished sexual deviance hard, and often very publicly. Let's start small. Say you're caught having sex outside of marriage. If you're lucky, and we use that word loosely, you're issued a fine. These were known as Lehrweit fines in some places, a payment due when an unmarried woman had sex, even if it was consensual. Only the woman paid. Not the man. Fair? Of course not. But it was profitable, lords made money off of every indiscretion, and church courts liked keeping score. If you're a repeat offender, public penance. That might mean standing barefoot in front of the church with a candle, dressed in a long white shift, while the priest details your sins for all to hear. People snicker. Others look away. Some pity you. But the stain lingers. Once labeled, you're whispered about forever. Especially if you're a woman. Adultery, though, was another beast entirely. A married person caught cheating faced far worse than fines. For women, the punishment could be brutal. In some towns, her hair was cut short. In others, she was stripped to her underclothes and paraded through the streets, sometimes with a noose around her neck as a symbol of moral death. Men caught cheating. Often fined. Occasionally humiliated. Rarely ruined. Unless, of course, he was caught with another man. Because now we wade into the most dangerous waters of all, medieval views on homosexuality. While same-sex desire existed, of course it did, and love between people of the same gender could be incredibly deep and openly affectionate, the Church drew a stark line. Any sexual act between men was considered a grave sin, often classified under the infamous sodomy laws. But here's the twist, those laws weren't always enforced consistently. Historians still debate the actual frequency of prosecutions. Some courts went decades without punishing same-sex behavior, especially if it wasn't public or scandalous. Others made examples of people. In Florence, male same-sex relationships were so common among apprentices that the city eventually created an entire task force to police them, the Ufficiali di Notte, or night officials. Kind of like morality police, but with very nosy ledgers. Penalties ranged from fines and exile to execution, especially in religiously zealous territories. France and England both recorded cases where men were burned for same-sex acts, though those were exceptional and usually tied to political or social scapegoating. As for women, well, lesbianism was largely ignored or misunderstood. The Church struggled to define it, partly because they couldn't imagine women experiencing desire without a man involved. When it was discovered, the punishment ranged from penance to whipping, though actual executions were incredibly rare. And yet, queer love persisted. Letters survive between women expressing passionate, aching affection. Monastic friendships blurred into romances. And in some medieval Arabic poetry, male-male desire was openly celebrated. Culture wasn't monolithic. There were pockets of acceptance, or at least, quiet tolerance. But when that tolerance ended, it ended loudly. Imagine being summoned before a church court. Your neighbors have whispered. A rival has accused you. The bishop wants answers. You kneel, swearing innocence. But if the evidence is there, a letter, a witness, a pregnancy, there's little escape. Sometimes the accused were branded. Others had to undergo purification rituals, like walking barefoot to a shrine or fasting for 40 days. More often, they were exiled. Kicked out of the town. forgotten. Or worse, remembered only in records labeled filth. And let's not forget incest, bestiality, and rape, the truly grave crimes in the eyes of both church and crown. These acts, when discovered, could provoke the harshest punishments. Whipping, mutilation, execution. Even nobility wasn't spared if the crime was heinous enough. One 13th century case from England involved a man caught assaulting a child. He was publicly hanged after being forced to walk through the streets carrying the victim's tunic. The message was clear: some sins couldn't be washed away. But not all justice was formal. Villagers often took punishment into their own hands, shaming rituals, for example. One popular custom was the chivalry, a noisy parade meant to mock someone who had committed a sexual or social transgression. People banged pots and pans outside the offender's house, wore masks, and shouted insults. Sometimes it was aimed at adulterers. Sometimes at widows who remarried too fast. Occasionally it was just cruel fun. Still, not all sexual punishments were driven by righteousness. Sometimes they were political. A rival accused you of fornication to seize your land. A spurned lover whispered lies to ruin your standing. A lord manipulated the law to claim your daughter's dowry. Because in the end, sexual morality was a tool. A weapon. A way to shame, control, profit, or silence. And while the rules were carved in stone, how they were applied, that was always slippery. So as you walk past the church again, and hear the echoes of confessions whispered through cold stone walls, remember, not all sins were real. And not all punishments were just. But they all left marks, on flesh, on families, and on memory. It's late now. A candle flickers low beside your bed, the room wrapped in a hush so deep you can hear the wood beams creak as they settle overhead. You lie back and exhale, your mind drifting over everything we've explored. And now, one final chapter remains: what happened to your body after death, and how your sex life might still be judged. Because in the medieval imagination, sins of the flesh didn't always stay in the flesh. Death was never far away in this world. Plague, famine, war, childbirth, bad fish, any one of them could take you in a heartbeat. So when people thought about what came after, they did so in graphic, visceral terms. And sex. That was one of the most closely watched entries in your celestial ledger. Let's begin in the graveyard. You're buried in consecrated ground, hopefully. If you died excommunicated, unshriven, or in the act of sin, you might not be granted a spot inside the churchyard wall. Worse, if you were known for sexual transgression, adultery, fornication, sodomy, there were whispered fears that you might rise again, but not in the nice, Easter morning kind of way. People believed corpses of the damned could become revenants, restless undead spirits who wandered the village at night, knocking on doors, spreading disease, or dragging their rattling chains through the alleys. In some accounts, these sexual sinners returned bloated and reeking, a kind of undead warning against lust. To stop them, villagers sometimes dug up corpses and drove stakes through their hearts, or cut off their heads and buried them separately. Some scholars say this was just fear of plague. Others believe it was a moral panic, a physical punishment carried into the afterlife. Better safe than sorry, right? And if you made it past the grave? Then came Judgment Day, that terrifying moment when your soul was weighed. Many medieval artworks show the scene: Christ enthroned, angels with scales, demons crouched nearby, tugging at naked souls who look increasingly panicked. And often, it's the sexual sins that tip the scale. Lust was one of the 7 deadly sins, the one most commonly confessed, the one most easily committed, the one hardest to resist. Priests warned that carnal desire was like a fire, let it smolder quietly in marriage, and it warmed the house. Let it blaze freely, and it burned your soul. You remember the sermons. They were everywhere. Carvings in church. Stained glass windows. Even miracle plays performed in town squares, complete with devils in red tights chasing harlots around with pitchforks while the crowd laughed nervously. But it wasn't all fire and brimstone. There was also purgatory, a place for souls not damned, but not ready. A spiritual waiting room where you burned off your earthly mistakes. And yes, the more earthly your mistakes, the hotter the fire. People feared a long stay. So they paid for indulgences, donations to the church that supposedly shaved time off your sentence. Rich folks gave generously. Poor folks prayed harder. And everyone lit candles for those already passed, hoping to ease their passage. One particularly morbid custom. The sin eater. In some rural areas, a man was paid to eat a piece of bread placed on the chest of the deceased, symbolically absorbing their sins. Especially if they had no priest. Especially if they were believed to have died in sin. The sin eater was both feared and needed. A human sponge for the things no one wanted to talk about. And what of heaven? For those who followed the rules, married properly, avoided fornication, confessed fully, there was peace. Eternal reward. Spiritual bliss. But here's the uncomfortable truth, heaven was never described as particularly romantic. Sexual love, even inside marriage, didn't carry over. You became like the angels, they said, without desire, without need. A sterile paradise. Historians still argue about this. Was the suppression of sexuality in medieval theology meant to elevate the soul? Or was it a reflection of fear, of how powerful and uncontrollable sex really was? Because underneath all the warnings, there was always fascination. The same church that condemned desire also recorded it obsessively. The same priests who shamed you for kissing outside of wedlock also wrote long treatises on what qualified as a sinful thought. And in the end, the medieval world didn't reject sex. It just wanted to control it, box it in, tame it, explain it. But desire, like death, never truly obeyed. So here you lie now, safe under your blanket, with all these thoughts swirling like a murmured prayer. The lovers in the woods. The bride with trembling hands. The monk with a hidden letter in his sleeve. The widow who lights a candle for her third husband, and maybe for the one before him, too. These were real people. Full of longing, laughter, confusion, and hope. Not symbols. Not sinners. Just human. And if medieval life teaches us anything, it's this: the body doesn't stop being holy just because it's flawed. So let's let go now. Let the curtain fall. Let the torches gutter out and the streets grow quiet. The last chapter is finished, and the rest belongs to dreams. Your breathing slows. The night outside your window is still. Somewhere, the sound of distant bells, soft, almost imagined. You feel the weight of the past curling gently around you like a worn wool cloak. Not heavy. Just familiar. The world we wandered through tonight, so far from ours, yet so achingly human, fades into warm shadows. All those voices, all those stories. Some whispered, some laughed aloud, some buried deep beneath stone. They rest now. The monks have closed their books. The lovers have returned to their cottages. The babies are swaddled and sleeping. The priest extinguishes the last candle in the chapel, and the scent of wax lingers in the air. There's nothing left to chase tonight. No more rules, no more secrets, no more judgment. Only you. Your heart, steady. Your breath, slow. The world, quieter than it's been all day. Let your thoughts drift, like petals on a dark river. You don't have to hold on to anything. Not even the questions. Not even the strange and beautiful truths we uncovered. Just float. The past is behind us. The story is told. And tomorrow, the sun will rise over fields that no longer remember what we've seen. But for now, rest. You're safe. You're still. You're here. Good night.